The village of Manston is a short drive from the Kent coast. Down the road is the port of Ramsgate. In the village itself, there's a church and the Jolly Farmer pub. Next door is the airfield. And because of that, Manston's been welcoming new arrivals for years. In the 20s, Oxford students arrived for pilot training. In the 50s, US servicemen used it as a base to carry out drills. Now, Manston Airfield is hosting new arrivals again. Thousands are coming across the channel by small boat. Many are taken to this facility.
You've got an asylum system that is completely gridlocked.
And as more people have arrived, so too has politics. The government has condemned an invasion.
The system is broken. Illegal migration is out of control.
And so, a small village in Kent finds itself part of a story that raises fundamental questions about how the UK responds to those who arrive on its shores. Hello, welcome. Now, this is the plan this week. We'll talk about migration in a moment. I'll also look at why Joe Biden thinks Republicans' relationship with the truth risks a path to chaos. Then these are workers in China fleeing their factory. We'll explore how the reasons they've done this connect to all of us. And the war in Ukraine, of course, goes on, but establishing what's happening there remains hard.
So they try and control what we do, and our job is to not be controlled. They try and get their message over. Our job is to try and get the truth over.
We'll hear from Jeremy Bowen in a moment. This, though, is where we're going to start.
Britain's asylum system is in crisis.
Don't call it an invasion, but hey, it's over 40,000 people this year.
That's a lot of people, and this country, we can't afford them.
A few thousand people can be accommodated humanely in this country. We are perfectly capable of doing it.
You should not be sleeping on the floor of a tent for months on end.
The majority of the people don't want it. Send them back.
Migration has dominated the week's politics, and there are any number of questions about what's happening, how it's being talked about, and what's being done. Let's work through them, beginning with how the Home Secretary describes the situation.
The British people deserve to know which party is serious about stopping the invasion on our southern coast.
Well, these are the details of what Suella Braverman calls an invasion. The number of people arriving by small boat has greatly increased in recent years. Nearly 40,000 have already landed this year. But next, look at the overall number of asylum claims. It's up, but the increase is nowhere near as sharp as with boat arrivals.
We've seen higher numbers of people claiming asylum than this, but it's the method of arrival, in particular this very unsafe way of arriving, that has increased significantly this year.
The numbers alone don't explain the pressure on the system. This is the migrant processing facility in Manston in Kent. It's 20 miles from Dover. It opened in February, specifically to process arrivals from small boats, but it's struggling to cope.
Children being shooed away are among the 4,000 or so who are crammed in at a facility designed to hold just 1,600 people.
You can't eat or sleep. It was like a zoo.
There's currently an outbreak of scabies. There have been cases of diphtheria and MRSA.
If they decide to break out because they've got nothing left to live for, God knows what could happen.
And these problems, well, they connect to broader ones with how long it takes to process asylum claims. This year, the backlog of cases passed 100,000, and the government's legally obliged to find somewhere for people to stay while they await a decision. For its part, the Home Office says it's tackling the backlog by increasing staffing and improving technology. It also says issues like safeguarding vulnerable people and modern slavery can cause delays. And there's another factor too, because when someone's asylum claim is rejected, in theory, they're deported. Well, last year, 806 asylum claimants were returned. That's down from over 10,000 in 2010. And listen to one more statistic on this. The government says that right now, There are 17,000 people it wants to send back to Europe, but it's only sent 21. My colleague Dominic Casciani explains why.
The reason for that is we have no proper returns agreements with any of these countries. That is one of the things we chose not to do when Brexit happened.
There are any number of aspects to the asylum system and the stories around it. But there's been one issue this week that's been getting a lot of attention. On Tuesday, Immigration Minister Robert Jenrick spoke to the BBC.
There are also some new challenges that have come up. For example, very large numbers of Albanians coming to the UK.
It's correct that the number of Albanians has shifted.
2 years ago, 50 Albanians arrived in the UK in small boats. Last year, it was 800. And this year, so far, it's been 12,000, of which about 10,000 are single adult men.
Which begs the question, why? Albania is in southern Europe. It has a population of 2.8 million. The UK government describes it as safe and prosperous. But prosperity is relative. Albania's median hourly wage in 2018 was €1.70, the lowest in Europe. In the UK, it was 9 times higher. But there's another reason why numbers are going up right now. We contacted an Albanian journalist, Fatjona Medini, who's been investigating.
So the numbers have been increased right now because it's cheaper. Before, for an Albanian that wanted to go to the UK illegally, they have to go on the back of a lorry. And this was costly, and this would cost like 20 to 25 thousands of pounds. While now you can cross the channel just by paying to the smugglers 3 to 4,000 pounds.
And to drive up demand, adverts like this on TikTok are being aimed at Albanians. This one offers dinghy for UK with safe passage. And of those who did come and do claim asylum, the Home Office says many show no interest in seeing their claim through.
We'll typically put them in a hotel for a couple of days and then they'll disappear. They'll work illegally in the UK for maybe 6 months, maybe a year, send the money home and then they'll go back to Albania.
And of those who don't abscond, recent data shows that 14% of asylum claims from Albanian men are successful. So the vast majority of Albanian men either never see their claim through or are rejected. To address this, the government says it wants to find a way to have a fast track for Albanians, so claims are heard in days, not months. It is, though, a different story for Albanian women and children. 90% of their asylum claims are granted.
Most of the Albanians getting a positive decision are female, and it's believed that many of them are victims of trafficking who haven't been able to, whom the Albanian state has not been able to protect, and that's why they've qualified for asylum.
Meanwhile, this week, matters became ever more political as Albania's Prime Minister responded to UK government claims that this is an invasion.
Is nothing but fueling xenophobia and targeting, singling out community and practically going totally against the great British tradition of integrating the minorities.
And while the politicians exchange opinions, it remains true that the number of Albanian men coming to the UK has changed. So has the way the UK and Albania deal with this. The Home Office notes, since signing our returns agreement with Albania in 2021, we've removed more than 1,000 Albanians. This means more Albanians have been removed from the UK than any other nationality. But that figure isn't just people who arrive by boat. But as the boats keep coming, this issue remains both a practical and a political challenge, as well as an ordeal for those who need safe haven. Now, to understand how immigration works in the UK, we need to understand the government department that oversees it, the Home Office. And Sir David Normington was the most senior civil servant there for 6 years. He worked with 5 Home Secretaries.
Quite glad I'm not there anymore because I can imagine the pressures and tensions they'll be feeling.
And I've been showing him some clips from this week.
We need to be straight with the public. The system is broken.
I think the trouble with the phrase "the system is broken," it implies that there is nothing to be done about it. And I think there are things to be done about this. Effectively, The system has to be repaired. But there isn't some magic bullet here. It is about managing this system effectively, and at the moment that is not happening.
The British people deserve to know which party is serious about stopping the invasion on our southern coast.
It's a misjudgment to use that phrase really. As Home Secretary, you have to be careful in your language. You do not. This was in the aftermath of a firebombing of one of the reception centres in Dover, and you need to keep calm, to use judgment, not to stir things up.
Here's a clip from BBC News in 2002.
Now, are some schools being swamped by the children of asylum seekers? The word swamping was one used by Home Secretary David Blunkett.
Perhaps also reflecting both Suella Braverman now and David Blunkett then, a sentiment that some people in the UK feel, that they want to hear politicians reflect their level of concern.
They do. They need to know that politicians are on their wavelength and understand what the public concern is. So I do understand that. Yeah. But as a civil servant, as an ex-civil servant, I don't have to like it particularly.
Can you remember this happening at the time?
I can. I wasn't in the Home Office, but I can clearly remember it. And of course, that was dealt with eventually. And
people coming on lorries,
people coming on lorries, people getting over fences, people getting onto trains and so on. That was dealt with, and because that was dealt with, people then began to look for alternative routes. It took them a long time, but that's why people are resorting to boats, partly. But in fact, the relevance of that to today is that the Home Office in 2006 was still dealing with the spike in asylum seeking in 2002.
Right.
3.5 years after the spike. And that just tells you, if the system gets out of control, getting it back into shape takes years.
It's 4%. 4% of people arriving in small boats last year had their asylum claim processed.
That's the bit that is so seriously broken. Only 4% of last year's people coming over in boats have actually been decided. 4% of those people have actually had their application claims decided. That is a collapse of decision taking, and every time you don't decide on an application, that's somebody who's stuck in a hotel or stuck in private
and
rented
is that just money, that not
accommodation.
enough money is being spent on the decision making?
Well, I'd love to be able to tell you what the answer is to that. I
You're
don't
still
know.
working it out.
I don't think it's a lack of resource.
Up to 1,000 migrants were supposed to stay here for about 24 hours.
It's very distressing to see children there. That's the first thing. The absolute priority is to protect children. They shouldn't be in those conditions, so one needs to get those families out of there. You can be tough on immigration and asylum, and you should be, but that doesn't mean to say you have to be inhumane. You have to treat people properly in this process, and I'm afraid that shames us all.
You said it took several years for you to work with others in the Home Office to regain control of the situation you inherited. Does this problem look on a similar scale?
It does, because the backlogs are growing again. They have a backlog of 100,000, not 450,000, but 100,000. That backlog looks as though it's going to grow. It's not going to be sorted out quickly.
Was it the hardest thing you did as a civil servant?
Being at the Home Office was the hardest thing I did by quite a long way.
So you're thinking of your former colleagues now?
Yeah, I feel for them, but they do need to get a grip.
Now, sometimes there's a single moment in the news that's urgent and important in its own right, but also offers us a window into something much bigger. And that happened this week, when some video clips from a road in China started to appear online. Earlier this week, these workers fled a Foxconn facility in central China. It's known as iPhone City because it can make hundreds of thousands of them every day. And this facility has been under a variety of COVID restrictions for months. Fearing those restrictions could get tighter, some workers decided to get out. Some of them were met by officials in hazmat suits. And this desire to get out reveals a great deal about China's zero COVID policy, and also about how President Xi's leadership is impacting all of us. Here's how. Zero COVID is very much still in place. This week, Disneyland in Shanghai closed its doors after a single case. No one could leave until they tested negative. This is elsewhere in Shanghai this week, and across China, local lockdowns are common. Everyone in China knows this, and some are keen to avoid them. This is footage from IKEA in Shanghai in August as people try to evade quarantine. And this footage on a train in June gives you an idea of how the approach works. This puts China out of sync with the rest of the world's COVID strategies, but with underperforming vaccines and concerns about its health service, zero COVID remains, as does the pressure it creates. This was a rare anti-lockdown protest last week in Tibet. But President Xi talks about the people's war to stop the spread of the virus and argues,
people's lives come first. We will not waver in our zero COVID policy.
And that commitment connects to something fundamental about President Xi's leadership.
Xi Jinping has consistently prioritized politics ahead of economics. He's not afraid to take risks that mean the economy will suffer, and his COVID zero strategy is a prime example of that.
This can be seen in the elevation of this man, Li Qiang. He's to become China's premier, second to President Xi. It's a huge promotion, and this is a man who's been responsible for enforcing lockdowns in Shanghai. That promotion sends the clearest of messages on zero COVID. But while the politics of this makes sense to President Xi, zero COVID comes at a cost. In the words of this leading economist, zero COVID has slowed the country's economy and exacerbated supply chain disruptions. One US analyst called zero COVID a driver of global recession. Of course, China remains the starting point of the global supply chain. It makes 29% of the world's goods. But zero COVID has made it a less reliable supplier. And that shift is a symptom of a broader decision by President Xi.
Xi Jinping inherited a China that for decades emphasized economic growth and the building of ties to the outside world, even sometimes putting that ahead of the supremacy of Communist Party rule. But in the past 10 years, he's flipped that around, putting himself and his party policies at the very top of the agenda.
And that's why the plight of workers escaping a Foxconn factory this week is one aspect of a far bigger story that extends to President Xi's consolidation of power and to the high streets where Chinese-made goods are sold. President Xi's decisions affect those Foxconn workers directly, but they also affect us all. As you'll know, there are great challenges in knowing what's happening in China. The government there severely restricts what journalists and everyone else can do. And in a very different way, there are also challenges in telling you what's happening in Ukraine. Ukraine's southern offensive is a crucial part of this war. Its main focus is the region of Kherson. The areas controlled by Russia are marked here in red. And the big prize is the regional capital, also called Kherson. It's strategically and symbolically important, but despite how much this matters, finding out what's happening there is hard. Ukraine's imposed reporting restrictions. Most of the front line remains off limits to journalists. Some, though, do get limited access, and the BBC's Jeremy Bowen is one of them. A little earlier in the week, I messaged Jeremy and asked if he'd record his thoughts on where the battle has got to. Let's take some time to see what he sent.
My conclusion about the Kherson offensive, which has been ballyhooed now for months, is that it's moved either very slowly after some earlier successes, but the main thrust of it is stalled. And so how do I assess that? Well, here's an example. If an army is attacking, there's a buildup of men, of machines, of ammo. And I haven't seen any of that. Seen a little bit of military activity. But, you know, we've heard that they're not as well supplied as they'd like to be. And you need that preponderance of offensive power to break a well-prepared position. So a lot of it is second guessing and trying to work things out. You know, it is difficult.
As Jeremy says, it is difficult. What's happening inside the city of Kherson is unclear. We do know, though, that in the wider region, Ukraine has regained some territory, but reporting on those gains poses challenges.
The Ukrainians are quite controlling about what they let us film. Now, yesterday, after these raids, and this was part of it, we went to an area to film, and there was a large university building there, and we weren't allowed to film it. We could film the civilian houses that were hit and destroyed, but we couldn't film the university building. Why? I don't know. Were they doing something there that was secret? Did they not want to show the Russians that they'd managed to hit it? You know, we don't know these things, but there's often also a pattern, which is when the war is new and when there's that sense of shock that it started, you can do local deals as a reporter with commanders, and you say, well, will you take us up to your positions? And they say, yeah, come on. But after a month or two, what tends to happen, not just here, but in pretty much every other place I've been, but pretty much every other war I've been to, is that they get organized. Their information side gets organized. And so they put restrictions on what we do. It's not a sinister thing. This is what always happens. These days, in the 24/7 digital world, that winning the media war is critical for all sides. They want to get their point of view across. So they try and control what we do, and our job is to not be controlled. You know, strategists talk about the fog of war and trying to work out what the hell's happening. So personally, as someone as a journalist, I've covered 20 or more wars, I'm not surprised that it is difficult to find out what the hell's happening, because it's always like that.
Now, it's the midterm elections in the US next week, and there's an awful lot at stake, not least how much Joe Biden may be able to get done in the next 2 years. But there's more to these midterms too, because they're helping us understand America's relationship with the truth.
This is our country.
Elections are always about policies and personalities, but on Wednesday this week, Joe Biden made it about more than that.
This is a path to chaos in America.
And the president connected that warning directly to this.
The 2020 election was rigged and stolen, and now our country is being destroyed.
Donald Trump's been saying this since election night. It wasn't true then, it's not true now. And this claim has become a test of Republicans' commitment to facts, to evidence, to reality. Next week's midterms include elections for both houses of Congress and some state governors. And we've worked with the BBC's disinformation unit to look at Republican candidates in these elections. We found that 35% of the candidates have publicly and fully denied the 2020 election result. Of those, 3/4 are projected to win. And overall, 53% of these candidates have questioned the election result, and these candidates are in sync with many Republican voters. One poll this year found that only 32% of Republican voters think the 2020 election was free and fair. Certainly, we can see this in how some Republicans are positioning themselves. One example is Carrie Lake, who's running for governor in Arizona.
If you're watching this ad right now, it means you're in the middle of watching a fake news program. You know how to know it's fake? Because they won't even cover the biggest story out there, the rigged election of 2020.
Of course, the media did cover the election. There's just no evidence it was rigged. And the BBC's Catty Kay asked Carrie Lake about this.
Do you really believe the 2020 election was stolen?
Yes, absolutely. I'm not the only one who believes it.
She isn't the only one. And Donald Trump believes this is what his supporters want to hear. Blake Masters is also running in Arizona. He's standing for Senate. And in a Fox Nation documentary, we see him talking with Donald Trump.
If they say, how is your family? She says the election was rigged and stolen. You'll lose if you go soft. You're going to lose that base.
You'll lose it if you go soft, Mr. Trump says. And next week's elections will be a test of that theory. But already this week, another story is testing Republicans' relationship with the truth.
A brazen and violent assault. Paul Pelosi, the husband of House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, brutalized.
Seriously injured after a horrifying attack with a hammer inside the couple's home.
The suspect trying to tie him up, quote, until Nancy got home.
The attack was last Friday morning, and senior Republicans condemned it.
Well, let me be perfectly clear. Violence or threat of violence has no place in our society. And what happened to Paul Pelosi is wrong.
Soon, we were learning about the attacker too. The LA Times reported that he spread QAnon and other far-right bigoted conspiracies on his blog. But Donald Trump's daughter-in-law was clear on one thing.
Anyone trying to connect this guy in any way to a political party, to any other person, you can't do that.
Plenty, though, made just that connection, like this conservative lawyer.
They're trying to pretend that this has nothing to do with the conspiracy theories that have been advanced among their voters.
President Biden made the link even more explicitly.
You can't condemn the violence unless you condemn those people who continue to argue the election was not real, that it's being stolen.
And as the impact of Republican misinformation was debated, a new conspiracy theory was emerging. CNN described it as
the deranged smear that Paul Pelosi and the attacker, the man who hit him in the head with a hammer, were in a sexual relationship.
There's no evidence to back this up, but that didn't stop Congressman Clay Higgins sharing a post suggesting the attacker was a male nudist hippie prostitute. He then deleted it. It didn't stop Donald Trump saying this to a conservative podcaster.
The glass, it seems, was broken from the inside to the out. And, that was, so it wasn't a break-in, it was a breakout.
Police say they have CCTV of someone breaking in. Once more, Mr. Trump was confronted with facts and evidence. And as he and other Republicans detach themselves from both, former President Barack Obama frames the midterms in this way.
Democracy itself is also on the ballot.
One senior Republican says the Democrats are simply trying to divide and deflect. Another Republican makes this point.
Wacky ideas have been around as long as there's been more than one person introducing the topic in a political conversation.
That is a true statement, but the claim about the election in 2020 being stolen is false. Now, voters make their choices for a range of reasons: the economy, crime, immigration. But these midterms are, in part, a test of where facts fit in to Americans' list of priorities. And as this week we consider the state of US democracy, on Thursday, the Bank of England made sure we considered the state of the UK economy too. It raised interest rates, predicted a long recession, and said this.
These are big changes. They have a real impact on people's lives.
To which the Chancellor responded, his priority is to grip inflation. Jeremy Hunt also said this about the numbers of people arriving by small boats.
They've shot up in the last few years, and we're determined to grip that problem.
There is, as you can see, an awful lot to be gripped, and the question now for the government is how it will do that. Goodbye.